We've covered everything from the Big Bang, beginning of life, past evolution. Why did our brains get big in the first place? Richard Anderson is the author of the Amazon #1 bestseller and Nautilus Award winner, The Evolution of Life, which details the history of life and the universe, as well as the present and future of humanity, life, and the planet. Richard Anderson, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you. Yeah, pleasure to be here.
In your telling of the narrative of the universe and life, I really appreciated that, how multidisciplinary it was. You touched on, physics, chemistry, biology, microbiology, neuroscience, so to my pleasant surprise. So let's begin at the beginning of the narrative. As far back as science can take us, how did the universe itself begin?
Well, the most common theory, of course, is the Big Bang. And the age of the universe has typically been placed at about 17 billion years. Now there's some new information that may bring that into question, and maybe twice as old. But that doesn't really impact us here in this discussion, but it just shows that science, a lot of science is not settled yet. It's the best information we're going on, the best observations we have. So we'll start with the Big Bang, and that set the stage for the kind of chemistry that we have, the kind of elements that evolved are tied to the quarks and all of the subatomic particles that resulted from the energy released in the Big Bang. What caused the Big Bang is another lot of theories about that. So we weren't there, so we don't know. But anyway, the chemicals were released, the energy was released, and I traced the story from the formation of the elements, and a lot of those were formed in the process of the Big Bang. There was enough energy released to form most of the chemicals of life. In fact, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen. A lot of these more complex molecules or atoms were formed during the Big Bang. The later elements were formed by exploding stars, supernova that would release a whole lot of energy.
How is it that supernovas generate elements?
Well, it's basically what they do is when they explode, they release so much energy that they cause a fusion of smaller elements. So hydrogen to helium. Our sun, in fact, is not exploding, but the fires of the sun result from the merging of hydrogen atoms to form helium atoms. In the process, there's some leftover energy, which is what we feel as sunlight and all the radiation that comes from the sun, and that's common with all stars. It depends on what they're burning. If they're burning hydrogen, or if they're burning a higher element that's been released by supernovas. So when the star is massive enough, many times more massive than our sun, when it explodes, it creates enough energy to fuse some of these larger elements into even heavier elements. So it forms new elements. And that's one process that creates the chemistry or the elements of our of our universe. Now, there's a lot of energy being released by stars. Ultraviolet is one example, and ultraviolet radiation is toxic to organic molecules, but it also, in space, it can combine and form organic molecules such as amino acids or precursors to nucleic acids, and they're floating around
in space.
In space, they're floating around out there. In fact, they just discovered a big cloud. I don't know where it was, but out in the universe, out in open space, they discovered a big cloud of ethanol, alcohol, that was formed by the energies of space. So if there's a destination you want to go to, that might be a place. It's probably well aged, but I doubt if it has any oakiness to it. So anyway, these elements, these molecules that were formed in space by the energy released by the Big Bang are the precursors of life. And it's believed that they rained down on our planet and different moons and probably other places in the universe, and could have been the seed that began the life formation. Now there were a number of theories of you have to bring these molecules together for them to interact. They have to be in a high enough concentration for chemical reactions to occur. So there were a lot of theories. They can't be just diluted in the seas. Nothing will happen because they're not interacting.
They're too spread out.
They're too spread out. So there were some theories. Originally, they thought, well, maybe they could collect on surfaces of clay and concentrate there and form living matter. The most recent thing is what's called black smokers, and these are today they still exist along the Mid-Atlantic Ridge in the Atlantic Ocean, where hydrogen sulfide and other gases are very hot, come up from deeper in the earth, and they form these calcified chimneys. And there's a huge temperature gradient between the bottom of the sea, the water, and the water coming up from further deeper in the earth. And that creates a source of energy for molecules to come together. And we know in the laboratory, we know that to form nucleic acid, chains, it takes a lot of heat energy. And nucleic acid is very resistant to heat. So the theory is they could form, and anyway, that's what the belief is that the cells of early life began in these black smokers.
So this would be a place where there are the right molecules or the right elements, atoms, molecules that can come together to form the fundamental molecules of life. Right. And then some of them require energy to bond. And so the black smokers provide sufficient energy. Heat, so that these molecules can actually come together. So how do you go from molecules to replication?
Yeah. There's a number of steps that are not understood. It happens that these black smokers internally, because of bubbles probably that came up with the hot water and hydrogen sulfide, they form little chambers. And interestingly enough, these chambers are small, like cells are small. They're on that scale. And we know that lipids form cell membranes. So lipids have, it's a molecule that has a fatty end, and it's called an aromatic end, and it has a aliphatic end, which one end of it dissolves in fats, the other end dissolves in aqueous, in water. So they come together tail to tail and form a membrane, and this happens automatically. So it's like a soap bubble, and it can enclose your chemicals, and they can start reacting with one another. There's some problems when these things would go into the open water, and that they would explode because of osmotic pressure, which means too much water would come in because there's a concentration of chemicals within the bubble higher than the concentration outside. So it would draw water into the bubble and it would burst. So you need a cell wall as well as a membrane. And so there's a lot of steps that had to happen before you actually had a living, reproducing life form. And of course, the first bacteria, probably, bacteria-like, there's another organism called archaea, they're like bacteria. Those were probably the first organisms on the planet. So their reproduction was they would grow until they frankly got too big for a proper diffusion and metabolism, so they would divide. And so where there was one, there would be two. And if the food supply was enough, or the energy supply was enough, they would continue to grow and divide. If not, they would, die out, reduce their numbers, and so forth. So the evolution from that point was anaerobic. There was no oxygen on the planet. A highly nitrogen atmosphere. There was probably some methane, carbon dioxide, but no oxygen. So the world at large was what we call was in a highly reduced situation. It was not oxidized. So if you have iron that is oxidized, it's rusted. So the iron was black instead of red. So if you see black iron that is in a reduced state, it is not oxidized. And as the surface of iron, you leave it outside, it starts to rust. That's oxygen interacting, changing the iron element.
So it's oxygen bonding with the iron atoms to form a molecule?
Yeah, it has to do with the moving electrons. So the world was anaerobic, complete lack of oxygen, until an organism called or similar to what's called cyanobacteria, which is a photosynthetic bacteria that produces oxygen as its end electron acceptor. So the process of using the energy from whatever source, sunlight or in this case it was sunlight, is transporting electrons through a process that releases energy. Anyway, that gets a little complicated. So the cyanobacteria probably grew on the surface of the seas in mats and slowly released oxygen into the environment, into the atmosphere, which was then absorbed into the seas, and iron began to rust and so forth. And finally, after all of those minerals were oxidized, the atmospheric oxygen could start to accumulate. And that was toxic to most organisms, almost all organisms on the planet, because they had a different kind of metabolism. So but it was highly energy efficient. It was a good system, so it prevailed. We still have anaerobes, and they still live deep in the soil. They've been found in deep mines, in diamond mines in Africa, miles underground, and they live chemically, off of chemical energy and heat. They don't require light. They have a different type of metabolism. So they still survive, but the surface of the planet and the surface of the seas are aerobic. Our fish breathe oxygen through the water. Of course, all land animals and plants are oxygen dependent today. So that was the first breakthrough in our evolution. And in fact, the cyanobacteria, probably the cyanobacteria, and an arcacia was a different kind of a unicellular organism. United, one engulfed the other, and they became a higher level of cell called a eukaryote. So the bacteria and blue-green algae are both prokaryotic. They are simple cells, and simple, I mean, they're very complex, but they're simpler than the eukaryotic cell, which is what all trees, all higher plants, and all animals and insects are made out of, eukaryotic cells.
And what's the distinction between prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells?
Prokaryotic, well, in a nutshell, prokaryotic cells digest their food from their surrounding environment by secreting or expelling enzymes, digestive enzymes, and waste products into the solution around them. And they pretty much require a lot of water in their environment. So the disadvantage of that is if you have a bunch of them growing in an area close proximity, they start to create a toxic environment for each other. They're all throwing out all their toxic waste. They're sending out digestive enzymes, and pretty soon they start to die off, and until some portion of them drifts off into a new ecosystem, a new place in the ocean or wherever they are. So they don't associate very well together. They can't form multicellular organisms because they are toxic to one another. They compete for the same food source, and their byproducts are build up to a toxic level. Eukaryotic cells have intracellular structures, so they carry out the digestive process. They engulf food, and they carry out the digestive process internally and within the cell, so that they're not throwing all those heavy-duty enzymes out into the environment to damage other nearby cells. So they have the potential, when you have a eukaryotic cell, it has a potential to form a multicellular organism with tissues that are specialized, like we have, and like all animals have. And the organelle that is associated with the bacteria or archaea that was engulfed is called the mitochondria. And it's the analogy is it's like the battery of the cell. It's the energy organelle of the cell. It has different DNA. It's carried, so in when we have our DNA analyzed, they can trace the mother's side, or they can trace the father's side on your genetic heritage, and the mother's side is traced through the mitochondria because only the egg carries the mitochondria, the sperm does not. So that's all the mitochondria are from your mother. Well, what the mitochondria does has this different DNA. It has a different division, reproduction cycle than the cell at large, than the cell itself. So it can be, you can have 2 or 3 mitochondria in your cells, or you can have 150. Depending, so that allows the cell to specialize. If a cell requires a whole lot of energy, it can have a lot of mitochondria. So your liver cells, your pancreas, all the cells that produce enzymes and hormones and things like that have a lot of mitochondria. They're high energy. Cells like your nerve cells, they don't have a lot of mitochondria. They are they have a lower metabolic rate. So,
really, I would expect nerve cells to have a high metabolic rate.
Yeah, they have a high action, but the metabolic rate is not. They don't divide very often, and they don't produce hormones or enzymes or anything like that. So yeah, you would hope that they're highly active, your brain and your nerves and so forth, and they are. But as far as energy requirement, they don't require the same level as your liver, for example. So the difference between when the eukaryotic cell evolved, that was very important in our own evolution, and it made the multicellular animals and plants possible. And then different forces could play out on evolution. So like I said, you could have cells and tissues develop that specialized in different functions, and you could create an organism that was altogether much more effective in its environment, responsive to changes in the environment, and so forth. So that's our biological evolution in a nutshell. When we started to form, say when humans evolved, there were a number of mutations that happened, and there was some self-directed evolution as well. And the self-directed was not intentional. It was the environment we created impacted our own evolution. And we're doing that today. We do that with animals when we domesticate them. We select out the qualities we want in the animal, and we breed for that. And with food crops, we do the same thing. It's called hybridization, or we do some modification of their DNA to produce a product that we want, that we desire. So that is evolution that's directed by our activity. Well, when humans first started, humanoids, I should say, they're not Homo sapiens. When humans first started on this planet, humanoids, they had a limitation in brain size. And the big factor was the birth canal of the female, and that you could not give birth to a head larger than the birth canal. So if that kind of a head formed in a fetus, mother and child would probably die in childbirth because the fetus could not be born. So that was a limitation to head size, and that's still a limitation in the animal world. Primates and dogs and antelopes and everybody else, except for humans, their head size is limited to the birth canal size. So what happened? There was a mutation that slowed the bone development in humans, and it allowed the birth to occur when the skull wasn't fully formed. So there are sutures, and the bones kind of floated like our tectonic plates on the planet.
And sutures are like little cracks in the skull that allowed it to move around a little.
The bones haven't come together; they haven't sealed together, and so the skull can kind of bend in shape and transform and so forth as the baby is born. And sometimes, if you've ever seen a picture of a newborn, sometimes the head is a little bit misshapen, and you go, "My God, what happened?" Well, they were born, and in those cases, the head will, the bones will realign and it will come back into its normal shape. But that's what allowed a large-headed baby to be born, and that was an important step in our evolution. Another thing happened concurrently, and that was a brain. Your brain requires a lot of metabolic energy. About 20% of the energy your body produces goes to just maintaining your brain, even if you're not thinking, like a lot of people don't think. But the brain is still continuing to take care of itself, I guess.
And it's running a lot of the processes of everything else just behind the scenes the whole time.
Yeah, the autonomic system is going whether or not you're thinking. So,
thank God for that.
So it required a stable and high-calorie food source, this brain, to support. So agriculture came along and help support that, help provide a reliable food source to reduce the times of famine and so forth. Initially, I think our diet was pretty heavy on, there were large animals and so forth that we hunted and killed with spears and ate. And so, and in fact, the early man, before spears, there's evidence that they were scavengers, but they weren't very strong. So after the saber-toothed cats and all the big predators were through with a carcass, it would leave a pile of bones. And there's evidence that these humanoids would come up and with rocks, they would pound and break the bones, break the bone, the large bone, the femurs and so forth, and they could twist and pull and they could get to the bone marrow. And the bone marrow was essentially sterile because it's like in a sealed container, and even though the animal was laying out in the savannah somewhere, the bone marrow was pretty sterile, so they would eat it. The bone marrow, which has a lot of fat, a lot of calories. So perhaps that's where humans first, or humanoids first, got a taste for meat, and also benefited from the calories that they received, supporting this large brain. Mm-hmm. So that early step, and then the development of agriculture, supported that mutation. Somewhere in there, the opposing thumb came along, and that made our manipulation of tools possible, so that we could develop technology.
Why did our brains get big in the first place? So we had this ability to manipulate tools, that kind of thing. But why did it grow in the first place, as opposed to other primates similar to us that now are significantly less intelligent?
It's a concurrence of a lot of fortunate events, but this points out a primary force in evolution. When a mutation happens that gives a benefit to the organism, that organism then has an advantage in the environment and will reproduce much quicker than its competition. So humans, and of course, if we look at ourselves today, we're the dominant species. And in fact, we're so great in number and have such an impact on our environment that we threaten it. We threaten the place we live. So the advantage, the mutation gave us a huge advantage. It was a random mutation in a control mechanism that controlled the rate of bone development. It was a fortuitous event for sure, but you'll see there are other things that happened that really triggered a big evolutionary step. But the other thing that agriculture did was it allowed us to become less nomadic and use fire and cooking more than previous. So instead of eating raw food, we could cook it. That did two things. It sterilized the food, so we were less inclined to be infected with bad stuff, bad bugs, and it also releases more calories. So if you eat uncooked food, your body can process a smaller percentage of the available calories in the food. If you cook it, especially vegetables, but that goes with meat too. If you cook it, the calories are the proteins and the fiber and all that stuff is partially broken down already. Makes digestion easier and more complete, and we reap the benefit. So humans were able to, once they started cooking food, they were able to consume more calories, which meant, and also because the digestive system was so much simpler, our digestive tract became smaller. So if you look at the great apes and you look at some of these other animals, they have a huge abdomen. You look at a cow, for example, it has two stomachs because it needs two stomachs and a bunch of bacteria in there to break down the grass and straw to be able to digest the food and get some energy from it. So our digestive tract is very small compared to herbivores, compared to even predators like lions and tigers and bears and so forth. That allowed a smaller gut. Okay, so a smaller gut had an impact on our posture. We could be more upright. We didn't have to walk around halfway on all fours like a chimp or a gorilla does. They can walk upright, but not very effectively. We could run. We ingested enough calories that we could build up a lot of glycogen in our femurs and our legs, and we could run prey down, especially if it was wounded. But we could chase prey down because they tired quickly. And you could stampede a herd of antelope. And if you had a group of 15, 20 cavemen chasing this herd, they could run the herd into exhaustion. And then once the herd was tired, had no more energy, they were easy kill. So that gave us that ability to cook our food, and the advent of agriculture affected our bodies in positive ways and gave us a competitive advantage. The fact that we have binary vision, like a predator, like the primates, like lions and tigers and bears, they have binary vision, allows us to focus and judge distance without moving our heads. Now, antelope or other animals like that are prey animals have their eyes rotated around to the sides of their heads. Yeah.
Wider field of vision.
Their field of view is much, much bigger, and they're looking for motion. So they're grazing, and they're constantly stick their head up, and they're sensing for motion. And if they see motion, they can move their head back and forth, and their brain puts this together as to give them depth perception. So they have to move their head to do it. Whereas a leopard stalking the herd in the grasses can judge distance and remain very still without moving its head. And because the antelope, or whatever the prey animal is looking for motion as an alert. And they're not looking to focus on any particular area. They're looking basically for motion. So that those evolutionary things gave each species an advantage. The prey could see a broad field of vision and detect motion. The predator didn't have to move, could be very still and sneak up on his prey.
And I assume that our binocular vision, our specifically the ability to triangulate distance with our two eyes, because if you close one eye and then you close the other eye, you notice different images. And essentially we use those two images to calculate distance. I assume that also affected later spear throwing and use of bow and arrows. We were able to specifically calculate distance so that we could hit our mark. And that way save yourself a lot of running.
Yeah, the bow and arrow was a big advance because you could stay further away from your prey. The binary vision tells us that somewhere back in our evolutionary history, we were probably predators. Well, we still are, but that we evolved from the predator line rather than the prey line. So, and of course, now we're top predators because of our technology. So that binary vision, and then wherever the opposing thumb came from, was a break, a dichotomy from the other primates. None of them have an opposing thumb on their hands. Some of them do on their feet, but our hands are close to our eyes and our face, which allows us to manipulate and make tools and see things in front of our face up close.
That was exactly what I was going to say. Something along the lines of our intelligence was probably, at least a factor, selected for because we were able to manipulate objects, smaller objects, to make tools. Exactly. And that there was probably some selection for the best makers and manipulators of tools.
Absolutely. So in a tribe, say your tool maker, your spear maker, your that person would have high status, which would probably mean they reproduced more than, say, a lower status individual in the same familial group in the same cave or whatever. So these are some of the things that evolution, things that happened that propelled us to where we are. Now, when we get to mammals, that's a very interesting. There was a very interesting evolutionary step that happened there. So originally, you had the dinosaurs, and birds came from dinosaurs, and you had all the reptiles, and almost all the reptiles lay eggs. There are a few snakes that give live birth, and a few species that give live birth, but most of them lay eggs. And then you have the marsupials, which were outcompeted by, when mammals came on the scene, they were outcompeted all over the world except where they were isolated and protected in Australia and New Zealand, on those continents that are isolated so far from the mainlands. And so when mammals were introduced to those environments, they decimated the marsupials. They could really outcompete them. So the marsupials give birth to little, let's say a kangaroo gives birth to a little eraser-sized fetus. It's really tiny, and it crawls through the hair, up the abdomen, and into the marsupial's pouch, and there finds nipples and feeds until it grows big enough to become more independent from the mother. Mammals don't do that. Mammals carry their fetus to term, and everybody but humans. So a horse that gives birth, the calf is, or the pony is on their feet within minutes. A cow, a buffalo, an elephant. They're born walking. Basically, they're that mature. Humans, it has to do with maternal care. So humans were much more immature, but were pretty full grown, and we have a 9-month gestation, and elephants have a much longer gestation period. They can carry the fetus for a long time. And the mutation that happened was actually not a mutation. It was part of a virus that it had the effect of shutting down part of the human immune system. It countered the immune system. So a fragment of that virus was incorporated in human DNA. And where the placenta is formed, there's an isolation between the fetus and the mother, but there is some contact, some blood contact between the two. And the problem with the reason that marsupials existed is if the fetus went beyond a certain time, the mother antibodies would finally reject the fetus. It would build antibodies against the fetus. And this viral particle that was incorporated in the DNA prevented that, so that the mother, a human mother or a mammal, any mammal, when they carried their fetus to term, the mother was prevented from forming antibodies against the tissues of the fetus. So that was not exactly a mutation, but it was an incorporation of a viral product that gave mammals an advantage over marsupials.
So it was essentially a genetic alteration that allowed them to outsource the pouch function to the womb fully.
Yeah, exactly. So it's really pretty amazing when you realize these events happened, and they seemed highly improbable until you start to look at the time lapse. We're talking for 3.8 billion, 4 billion years since life formed on this planet. And initially, it took a long time for change. The evolutionary curve wasn't very steep. And then when a few critical things happened, they jump-started the process. So when the eukaryotic cell became a reality, all kinds of new opportunities opened the door for evolution. All kinds of avenues, things that could happen. And multicellular animals, when they started, and plants, when they started to develop, then there were even more avenues that could be affected by mutations and the whole scheme kind of speeded up. Now we are what we are today, and we can get into sociology a little bit.
We absolutely have to get into sociology. That is a very interesting topic.
So here we have a human that goes back, I don't know, pretty much as we are, Homo sapiens, maybe 500,000 years, maybe 1 million years. The time frame hasn't been really firmly set. They keep finding evidence in the archaeological data. So, but that doesn't matter. We've been as we are today for a long time. And so have we evolved? Well, actually, we have, because we have a thing with our brain called plasticity, which means our environment feeds back into our thinking process and what we're exposed to and what kind of problems we have to solve and so forth affects our neurowiring. So there's a basic template for our brain, and there are basic structures that vary from individual to individual. For example, male and female, men and women have slightly different brain structure. There are two little areas of the brain near the brainstem, one on each hemisphere of the brain. They're called the amygdala. And there's a left one and a right one. And they have to do with increasing or decreasing anxiety as one thing.
Essentially, like fear response, in a sense.
Yeah. And so women tend to have more, human females tend to have more issues with anxiety than males, and that's hardwired by the amygdala. And we can see the evolutionary pressure to cause that. And that would be the female was the primary support for the new offspring, had to protect the infants and the small child. And so whatever if they lived in a cave or wherever their protective environment, the female was responsible for, basically doing the home care of their offspring, while the male was primarily invested in hunting and out in the wild. So the female had to be protective, had to be aware of threats in the environment, and had to protect their offspring, their young. Whereas the male had to be risk taking. If you're going to go out after a mammoth, for example, that's a huge animal with great big tusks, and I'm sure you have the hunting team out there, and somebody's going to get injured. It's a high risk. So you had to have a tolerance for that. And so the men, the males who were more aggressive, more assertive, more less worried about what bad events could happen, would be more successful probably on the hunt. And so that was supported in that line of evolution. So there is a difference in the amygdala between males and females. There's also a difference between, and there was one small study that brought this out. So it hasn't been confirmed. It was a pilot study at, I forget the university. But there is a difference between worldviews, say, of progressives and conservatives. So the progressive, so an example would be you have a society or a clan living in a group of caves in close proximity. They hunt together, they form teams, they go out on the hunt. They have these spears that develop the spear tip and so forth. And they have a long, sturdy, branch or something to form the spear. But they have to get close to the animal for a kill. And they have to use teamwork and so forth. And then somebody invents a bow and arrow. And, the spear works. Everybody knows it works. And so it's the tried and true. So there's a group of people, most of the hunters are going to stick with the spear. And somebody is out there trying to develop the bow and arrow. The first ones probably weren't very strong. They couldn't bring down a large animal. Their accuracy probably wasn't that great. But those innovative cave dwellers who saw the potential kept working on it until they developed an effective bow and arrow. Now they could go out and from a distance, a little bit safer than with a spear, they could bring down their prey with a bow and arrow. So eventually, but if it failed, they always had the tried and true spear to fall back on. So eventually, both elements in a society were important. The conservative to maintain what we already know as the backbone of our support system, and the innovators, let's try something new and see if we can better our system. If it doesn't work, we always have this to fall back on. And both were necessary for the social evolution of humans. This is kind of my theory, but I've read enough, so I think there's probably other people who think that that's a possible reason why we have, between conservatives and progressives, we have different the amygdalae are different between those two groups of people in this study. They did another study, and this was a pilot study done by a university on convicted felons in a prison. And they did I forget what it's called, but they did CT scanning. It's while you're awake and conscious. It's live CT scanning. Functional, maybe it's functional CT scanning. So they could put a person in a CT scanner, and then they could ask them questions, show them pictures, do different things, and they could evaluate how their brain was working, where the blood flow went, what neuroactivity was happening. And the amygdala are connected to the prefrontal and frontal lobes of the brain. And they found in the felon, and what happens is you have the fight or flight syndrome. So you have a situation you need to take care of that is in your self-interest. So the first thing is whatever you can do to get yourself or resolve that situation, regardless of any consequential, subsequent problems that might develop. Your first inclination is only fight or flight, not anything else. So that's kind of reptilian. We think of that as what a snake would do, but that gets sent up to the prefrontal and frontal lobes, and it goes, well, wait a minute. If we do that, the consequences will be more detrimental than if we don't do it. And it sends a message back to the amygdala, and it shuts that down and says, no, let's not do what we first thought. So what they found with felons was that the connections between the amygdala and the prefrontal and frontal lobes were diminished, and that was a physical problem. They didn't have the strength of communication and feedback. So I like to use as an example the movie Fargo. You aware of that movie?
I unfortunately have not seen it. I'm aware of it because I read that you spoke about it in your book.
Oh, okay. Well, I I like that because it gives a perfect demonstration of the mind of a psychopath, psychopathic mind. There was a scene, I forget the characters' names, but there was a scene where they kidnap this woman and they're holding her for ransom, and they have her in a house, and it's upstate South Dakota. It's in Fargo or outside of Fargo. It's winter. There's snow all over. It's miserable. They sequester her in this house, and the one guy, so it's two men who kidnap her, and the one guy is she's strapped to a chair. She has a hood over so she can't see, her captors, and the guy is sitting there and he's watching TV, like daytime TV, some game show or something, inconsequential, and she's whimpering and crying, and she's in a bad way. And he tells her to shut up. He's watching TV, and she doesn't. She keeps whimpering and everything. He pulls out his pistol and he shoots her and kills her. And he goes back to watching TV.
And he accomplished his goal, which was remove distractions so I can watch TV in peace.
That was exactly right. Yeah, I've solved my problem. And to us it seems like, my God, what did you do just to watch? Because there wasn't the adequate connections to get the feedback to say, hey, don't do that. First of all, it's morally incorrect. It's really abhorrent, and you're likely to go to prison for it. You're going to get caught. You can't do. Anyway, there are a lot of stops. For normal people with normal wiring, normal social upbringing, who wouldn't consider such an action.
A lot of consideration that he just ignored.
Yeah.
So let's see if my understanding of this is correct. So you got the amygdala, roughly center of the head, responsible for threat response. So that's why it's responsible for fear, anxiety, but also some kind of aggression in the face of a threat. So that would be like fight or flight. Flight would be fear, flee, aggression, fight.
Yeah. So it's close to the brainstem. It's low down. It's our brain is we have the fish brain, we have the amphibian brain, we have the reptile brain, and we have the human brain on top. So we didn't get to go back and redesign it, from ground up. So we're stuck with the baggage of these lower life forms, and we've learned to compensate by the overlay of the higher forms. But when those connections to the higher forms fail, we revert to what the reptile would do. Remove the problem in his environment. By whatever means.
Yeah, evolution bootstraps and builds upon what it already has. Right. And so the specific dysfunction within psychopathic minds is, if I'm not mistaken, that the frontal lobes, which are responsible for inhibition, they're responsible for inhibition. Essentially, the amygdala gets the response, sends it to the frontal lobes, and the frontal lobes say, "Whoa, calm down. It's not going to matter in the future."
Well, they don't get the signal completely.
Yeah, so they have like a weakened transmission between those two, right?
Yeah, that's what and this was a pilot study. This was done at a university, and they haven't done follow through because they need funding. You have to justify. There haven't been follow up studies between people, liberals and conservatives, because I'm sure politically there's not a lot of support for that. I can see where that could be shut down. It's, this is a biased study or something. But the way we think is affected by the structure of our mind as well as the chemistry. So we know that hormonal imbalances there's the mind-body hormonal neural junctures, and there are all kinds of things that happen in the body that in Buddhism they call it the mind-body. It's like almost one. You can't have one without the other. And each affects the other. So, and getting to that, here's another idea that shows our integration with all of evolution, and that's called the microbiome. So we have in our body is about 30 billion cells that have our DNA, and about 33 billion cells that do not contain our DNA. So most of what we are, DNA-wise, volume,
It's not us.
Is not us. So what are we? Well, that's called the microbiome, and that's mainly the gut bacteria. So there are also bacteria in every orifice and on our skin, and it's part of who we are. We can't be sterile, So it happens that the microbiome sends messages back to the brain and helps to control our metabolism. I don't remember all the ways, but it's absolutely fascinating. So our diet and the kind of microbiome that we support in our bodies has an impact on our personalities and how we think. So it to me, it's a metaphor for how everything is integrated together on this planet. And we don't understand the whole thing, but we do understand some aspects of ecosystems and how different organisms dovetail with each other, and how the competition keeps everybody in balance. And when you do something to disrupt that nature or natural competition, you're affecting evolution in unknown ways. So right now, that's what we're doing globally. We're in an era called. So we went through on Earth, planet Earth. We went through a lot of extinctions, 6 major ones that directed evolution because they killed off large numbers of certain types of organisms, and those organisms that remained then had new niches to evolve into, and so there was a big impact on evolution by calamitous events that happened on this planet. Most of those were impact by asteroid-like objects or comets or volcanic eruptions, which the interior of the Earth was much more active. So those things impacted our evolution as well. We have now integrated ourselves with all the different life forms in our environment, and our diet now impacts who we are. And if we eat, continually eat highly refined foods that don't have complete nutrition that we evolved on, that has an impact on our microbiome, which has an impact on our longevity, which has an impact, and also on the way our brains operate, the effectiveness of our bodies. It's all interrelated and poorly understood, frankly. We just know that it's there and that it has a big impact, and it's a field of study. That to me was a real eye opener. So if we're going, so now we get to our planet, and how do we take care of it? How unique is it? Do we have other options from our planet? If we destroy our environment to the extent where it becomes really, really uncomfortable for us, what are our other options? Do we have a Earth 2 that we can go to? And can we settle Mars and terraform it? Those questions. So at the end of my book, The Evolution of Life, those questions lingered, and I started investigating possibilities in space. And so I wrote my second book, which is Outbound. The first book is science. The second book is hard science fiction. So it's called Outbound, Islands in the Void. And it's about placed about 250 years in the future. The Earth is trying to recover from a climatic disaster, and we're trying to utilize resources in space to help help Earth recover, and also to establish a foothold for humans in space to live there as a society. How could that happen, and what obstacles would we face doing that? So that's what I developed the story, and it starts on the planet Earth and things that I made a story out of it with, lots of characters and lots of action and naval battle and different things going on the planet, and then what's happening in space, the obstacles we face, how we have to create gravity. We have to carry our environment with us. We cannot adapt to a space environment. So we have to create an environment that produces one Earth gravity, called standard gravity. If we lived for a period of time in a reduced gravity, we would evolve, or we would devolve, in my mind. We would lose a lot of strength. We would lose, physical strength. We would atrophy physically. I don't think that's appealing to anybody. So we would have to maintain a standard gravity. And
that's because we just wouldn't be carrying ourselves anymore. But a lot of the load that is placed on our bones, our muscles, and even our cardiovascular system would just be reduced by the gravity. It'd be taken off.
Right. So it's been said that if you're in heart failure and you're say congestive failure, your blood can't pump the blood up from your legs very effectively. If you go into zero gravity, it's going to take that pressure off your heart. You probably live a little bit longer. But if you're a healthy person, you're going to degenerate. And if you're in zero gravity, and they've done a lot of studies with the International Space Station, with people staying up there for longer than a year, they find some of the bone loss and some of is not after a certain point, it's not recoverable. They come back and they never regain all of the bone loss. The biggest loss is on, of course, the weight bearing bones of our bodies. So it's the limbs, the legs, pelvic girdle, the spine. So people get in zero gravity for a period of time. They tend to get taller because your vertebrae start to separate a little bit. There's no compression force on your spine. And when they come back from space to Earth, there's a recovery period, and that depends on how long they've been up there. But they're carried off of these capsules in a chair a lot of times, or a stretcher, because it takes them a while to get the muscle tone back. They've lost some muscle mass. It takes a while to get some tone back where they can stand and walk again. Now, on the space station, they introduced exercise equipment to counter some of the muscle loss and bone loss. Because when you're exercising, you're compressing the bone with your muscles, so it offsets some of the effects of the loss of gravity. But if we're settling space, you're talking way more than a year. You're talking about a lifetime, and you're talking about carrying fetuses and giving birth. And what kind of effect does zero gravity have on that process? So my thesis is we would have to have standard gravity in any living environment. So these would be rotational cylinders that the colony would exist on the inner rim. And so we discuss a lot about that. Also, our long-range spaceships, the ones that go. So I have a settlement at Ceres. Ceres is a planetoid in the asteroid belt, and we're mining asteroids for resources in the space civilization. So we have a presence at Ceres in this story, but a trip to Ceres may take a couple of years, and depending on the position of that and to the position of Earth, it's going to be varying times to get there, but it's a long time in any case. So you're going to have rotating spaceships that create one gravity to maintain your crew, maintain their health during the trip. So I create this whole society out there. Now Mars, we get to Mars might have once contained life, and they're getting closer and closer to determining whether or not there's past life on Mars. Possibly even some present microbes that could live deep under the soil, but it'll be a long time before we know that. In going to Mars, say it's 7 months or 6 months or 9 months, it depends on when you launch. Your launch, that's called a launch window, when the positions of the two planets are aligned so that you have the shortest distance between the two. You would arrive at Mars, and suppose you're going to land on the surface. You have 1/3 gravity there. Still, you've been 7 months maybe at zero gravity. There's nobody there to take you off in a stretcher, So I see a problem with that, and so far NASA hasn't really addressed how they're going to deal with that and develop a rotational ship that would create one gravity. Even Elon Musk hasn't talked about that at all. You're going to fly there, and if it's a orbit and return mission where you don't land at all, then you're doubling the time you're at zero gravity, and you come back to Earth and you're in pretty poor shape. But
you'll essentially collapse as soon as you get anywhere near Earth.
Right. So there's been articles and suppositions and that we could terraform Mars. We could create an atmosphere. It once had an atmosphere. It once had water on the surface. We could do that again. And it's possible. And however, it would be a temporary thing, and it would require continuous energy and work, because the gravitational field of Mars is not enough to hold an atmosphere, and it does not have a magnetic field which would redirect the solar wind around the atmosphere. So the solar wind would constantly be stripping the atmosphere away as it was created. So it's not a solution. We're not going to terraform Mars. It's not a place that we can move to. Except I build a colony on Mars, and it's subterranean, and so it can have an atmosphere, and there are various steps taken to create one gravity, a standard gravity. It was a thought process of how do you do this, and you could do it, but it wouldn't provide a place for Earth to support an Earth-sized population, even half Earth population. So we don't have an option except possibly orbiting space islands that could be made from materials from the asteroid belt and from the moon and so forth. And there are enough resources out there that you could build millions of these things, and you could put them at different orbits around the sun, and you could even move them further out as the sun expands as it becomes a red giant. We're talking way in the future, but
yeah, we have some time to figure that out.
So yeah, there is some time, but our future, our immediate future, and I mean the next millions of years, is on this planet. And so we got to take care of it. So it always come back to that thesis. We need to repair what we've done, the damage we've done. We need to return a lot of our agricultural land to natural habitat to support the diversity of species, whatever is left by the time we get through this process, which means we probably cannot support as large a population of humans, maybe half We have 7 billion. It's going to be maybe 8 billion by the turn of the century. So maybe 4 or 5 billion would be a more optimal population size. And with declining birth rates, we may get there. I don't know. But our sheer numbers have put a huge stress on the population. And getting back now to societies and the formation of societies, we'll take a little step back for a minute. You have the seed of, well, for example, when you had cave societies, you had small familial groups up to maybe 100 people or slightly more. And you can only personally know and experience about that many people. Once the numbers become larger, 200, 300, 1,000 people, you cannot know everybody in your group. And the early caves, you had familial groups, and you had trust because they were blood relatives, or because you lived in close proximity and knew them, or they were from a neighboring cave and you hunted together and you bonded and you trusted each other. But once you start to form larger societies and you see people every day that you've never seen before, how do you trust that they're not going to do you harm, or that they're going to be somebody that you don't want to associate with? So, but if you have a common belief, if you have a common set of values, and ethics and morals, then you have that identity, and you can build trust with people that you've just met. Oh, you're a Protestant also, or you're Jewish too, and you're from South Africa, but I know nothing about that, but we have that in common. So religion and philosophy, but mainly religion, played a role in formation of early societies. The first religions, you had superstitions about supernatural beings and volcanoes and trees and animals and so forth. And then later you had ancestor worship. A lot of that is Asian. So it played a role in early society. But when you had a religion that united large numbers of people, it was usually based around a king, a pharaoh, or a leader, and they were considered gods. So their word, united everybody that was under their control, and so that was your common denominator, where you work together as a people because you were under the same king god. And then as religion developed into a more spiritual thing and divorced itself from kings and pharaohs, it could be involve a larger number of people and unite large societies. Now, the problem with that was that you had disparate religions around the world, and they bump up against each other. So if your neighbor nation has a different religion than your nation, it was a source of conflict and distrust, and that created a lot of problems. And we've seen that into the modern era in Northern Ireland with the Catholics and the Protestants, and we've seen that between Islam and Christian and Buddhism and Islam and these different religions can create friction between groups. So where initially they help form societies and help form legal systems and ethical moral systems, and there are common threads through all of the major religions in the world today. But there are people who take to the extremes. So that's an obstacle if we move into space, that's an obstacle. How do we live together as larger societies in very close proximity? These islands would be populated with as many people as they could hold, and you don't have wide open spaces like you can travel across the American West, and there's a lot of land there, a lot of space to get away from other people. Not the case in an island in space. So that would be an issue. How would we learn to live together?
And I think it's worth mentioning the critical importance of something like a shared value system, because it would allow people to predict the actions of the people in their community.
Absolutely.
Especially in a large community, because as a family, you know each other. It's not that many people to keep track of.
Right.
As you get to a somewhat bigger tribe, someone misbehaves, you kick them out, you kill them, exile them, whatever is necessary. But then if you get to a massive civilization, this allows people to predict other people's behavior because they know they share the same values. They have goal alignment. And since action occurs fundamentally in service of some kind of goal, because no one just really does something completely arbitrary, like you eat because you're hungry, you might show off because you want status, maybe because you want to mate, whatever it is. You're satisfying some kind of biological drive, or a more novel cultural drive, which is kind of biological in origin because you're attempting to gain some kind of social benefit. And this way they know everyone has the same values, everyone's on track with their actions, and that way you can predict what people will do, and it generates a kind of safety because you don't expect someone to come in and do something completely different.
Yeah, exactly. A trust.
Mm-hmm. And, yeah, exactly.
Initially, if say you're forming these islands habitable out in space, initially you're going to have scientists and engineers, maybe their families, and that's going to be because everybody is going to have a job that directly impacts this environment, to maintain the ecosystems within these islands, to develop technologies to build new islands and to harvest asteroids and to travel around, all of this stuff. So initially you're going to have a population, although they may be ethnically disparate, they may come from a number of different cultures, they're going to have science and technology as their common denominator, whereas society in general doesn't really have that focus. So I think initially you wouldn't have a lot of problems, but as this expands, and it would expand and include more social groups, how do we handle that? And I think we have a start. And I particularly like Western law, common law, and combined with civil law. They're two different things. Civil law says you do this is the punishment, or this is the result. Common law says, well, let's look at the circumstances of why whatever happened. Was it done on purpose? Was it an accident? Or were there extenuating circumstances? So that tempers the brute reality of civil law. So I think that's a foundation to build societies on. A philosophy rather than a religion. Everybody has a perfect right to believe in whatever religion or whatever beliefs they want to believe in. The problem is when you start to act on those beliefs and there's no foundation in reality for those beliefs. So if you develop a common philosophy and then it's science and technology based society, we don't have that today. We have pockets of it, but we don't have that in a broad sense. And are we going to go there? Are we going to get there? I'm hopeful, but we're going to go through a lot before that happens, I think.
Maybe yes, maybe no, because on the one hand, it seems that we're pretty wired for that sort of belief, for religious or spiritual belief.
Yeah, exactly.
Probably as a result of it being a part of our cultures for a long time. But on the other hand, we've already eliminated things. Eliminated. It's still in our heads. I believe there's a higher response in the amygdala when seeing an angry face from a different race as opposed to your own. I believe the response is slightly longer before the prefrontal cortex says it's just a picture.
Yeah.
But at least societally and culturally, we've largely eliminated this clear and accepted and outward distinction between people's races, ethnic groups, and that kind of thing. Now it's not so much physical as it is belief based. There's now it seems like more of an ideological or belief based segregation in a sense. It's not really segregation, but it's division more so. And so I think just as we were able to unify once, there's at least a plausible path forward that we could unify more, progress in that unification. So, but only the future will tell.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, exactly. We actually, if you look at the biology part of it, all people on this planet are more closely related. All people out of Africa on this planet are more closely related to each other, and I'm talking Europe, Asia, Southeast Asia, the whole gamut, are more closely related to each other than remote tribes in sub-Saharan Africa. So, about 70,000 years ago, there was a volcano down in the South Pacific, a massive eruption that spewed tons of material into the atmosphere. And it caused a huge migration out of Africa because these people they followed the herds, and the herds had to follow the grazing, and a lot of plant life in sub-Saharan Africa died because of the dust clouds caused by this volcano. So there was a mass extinction of humans about 75,000 years ago. And some people, and they've traced it back through, we spoke of the mitochondria, you can trace the female line. The diversity in our mitochondria and the mutation rate that happens over time, it's a pretty constant rate, so they can use it as a clock, says that there was a very small group of humans that survived this, and maybe 12,000 people, maybe less, very small. And that the rest of the world evolved from that small group of people. So even though we look different and we have different cultures because we grew up in different environments, genetically we're really closely related, and because of that. So when you look at that, it's like there aren't races. It's just an expression, a different expression of our genetic pool. You can, as an example, you can look at dogs. All dogs can interbreed with one another. They're all the same species, but there are breeds within that, which means they've selected out of this massive gene pool, people have selected out certain portions of the gene pool to express them with the kind of a dog that they want. So it's called breeding or selective breeding. They're still part of the gene pool. They're just a smaller part. So you can see the expression pretty much of all the genetic possibilities within the gene pool of dogs. So, but they're all the same species, and they look very different. A Chihuahua is much different than a Great Dane. And you wouldn't think by just looking at them, oh, they're related, but you wouldn't think that they're the same species. Yeah, they are. So a broad genetic diversity gives the species a strength. The bigger the diversity of gene pool, the stronger the species, the more adaptable it is, the more that some subset of the population will survive a calamitous disaster. We've insulated ourselves by our technology from most disasters that could have an impact on our evolution. But speaking to our social part of our society, our brains do evolve. We think differently than a 19th century person would think. We view the world differently than because we have experienced a different world than they have. The computer technology that has impacted people's brains is much younger than myself, because computers didn't exist for a large part of my life. But people who are born into computers and they're just second nature, they're going to be wired a little bit differently because of that exposure. And it also, there are problems with that. There's disinformation, there's propaganda, there's a lot of ways that this information that is transmitted via our technology can damage our viewpoint. At the same time, that same technology can give us a better view of our diversity and our commonality. So it's like any technology, it has a positive side and a negative side. And so the potential for us to come together is certainly there. To come together to experience enough similar things to realize that we are pretty much the same. Pretty much everybody wants the same thing: safety, security for their family, some options for recreation and pleasure, some control over their destiny. I mean, these aren't limited to any one group of people. Everybody wants these things, so we do have a lot in common.
And all it takes is a brief period of thought to realize that everything that we want it because it has some kind of reward pathway in our brains. And then the reward pathway in our brains are pretty much the same. They're functionally equivalent because the differences are so minuscule that we can effectively say they're the same in all human nervous systems. Therefore, our desires are roughly the same. There are, of course, variations acquired through nurture. So how you're raised, what you're taught, the information you acquire, your specific environment. But fundamentally, they all arise from the same neural substrates, the same reward mechanisms.
Yeah, exactly. Now, we all have DNA that's 99% the same. But when we develop in utero from a single cell, each step of that fetal development comes. There's a juncture, and it's almost like a roulette wheel. Okay, even though the DNA codes for certain things, it's not 100%. It's not 100% reliable. There's some potential for variation. And as an example, you can see two identical twins, and usually, if you get to know them a little bit, usually you can tell the difference. There are differences. Genetically, they're identical, but they did evolve in the same womb, and they were exposed to the same hormones and so forth. But there were differences in the way their DNA unfolded and created them, and so there are slight differences. So that is called epigenetics. It's outside of the actual sequence of our DNA basis. It's the way that unfolds and is translated and develops. So there's that causes some difference. But like you said about our brain being pretty much the same, if I'm thinking, if they do a live CT scan between you and I, and they say, imagine a peach. We'll both imagine a peach, and they'll show that they activate the same areas of our brain in each of us. So that thought is in the same place in both of our heads. So our brains are organized very closely together, so that they're standardized more or less. And then there's the minutia of variation, the connections, and there's a difference in intelligence. For example, some people, they just are mathematical whizzes. I'm not one of them, but or music, like Mozart, was playing the piano at 3 years old, composing his first music and so forth. So he had some special wiring in his brain. So there are variations in the structure, but essentially we all have the same brain, and with the normal variation of function.
Yeah, I'm hoping cognitive enhancement. I'm hoping that humans can figure that out at least at some point within my lifetime, to bridge the gap between everybody and people like mathematician Terence Tao. He looking at what he did at 9 in terms of mathematics, it's bizarre. It's like looking at an alien attempting to learn our mathematical systems. It's amazing how he just picks up on it. And the kid's 9. When I was 9, I was just playing Minecraft or something, and this kid was doing calculus. It's crazy.
It's so to answer the question of how are we going to evolve next, and the fact that a lot of our evolution was so much self-directed, even though unintentional. The development of fire and agriculture, and then some fortuitous mutations that gave us an advantage. Now we're at a point where our own thoughts, our own actions, our own technology, and our own use of science and information is going to direct our evolution, and I believe mainly our thinking into the future. That we will be able to figure out deficiencies in our brain in the way it evolved in response to a different environment than we're in today, far different than we are in today. So we don't need the flight or fright mechanism as strongly as we hold it today, unless we're a soldier on the front line somewhere. But our society is much, much safer and more secure than it was, when societies were first forming. It's much more predictable, and I think we're going to continue in that mode. And so, hopefully, some of the aberrations in brain formation will be detectable early on and maybe corrected through stimulus or through other means, so that we don't have psychopaths among us, for example. So yeah, I think that's the next frontier is our brain, and they do have it's this huge project. They have the human brain is much more difficult and complex than the Human Genome Project was. It turned out the Human Genome Project was solved much quicker than was anticipated, and largely because of computers.
And that's what I think will drive our evolution, really. I don't think it'll be so much biological evolution, since that is, unfortunately, it crawls at a snail's pace, but more so technological evolution, because just like with biological evolution, how it's sped up, it's been exponential. You can evolve way faster now once you have something like sexual reproduction. Similarly with technology, it's like biological evolution in that it bootstraps, it builds upon previous development. And so hopefully we can figure out something like neural architecture, neural rewiring, or just technological enhancement of the brain. It'd be pretty nice. It'd be fascinating.
It's like, if that does happen, there's a lot of possibilities, and both negative and positive.
Trade-offs as always.
So I'm dealing with an idea right now in the book that I'm writing, and that is robotic, sentient robots and their capabilities versus human capabilities, and how they might work together with humans. And I believe that when you look into the far future and you're trying to move out of our solar system, you're trying to move out into interstellar space as a species, you can't do that without robots. You can't do that without, first of all, going ahead of you and preparing wherever you're going to be habitable. We are very fragile when we look at the environments of outside of our protective atmosphere, and we're very vulnerable. Now, robots can be made extremely durable. They don't need an atmosphere. All they need is an energy source and a little maintenance, maybe. So I think they're a strong possibility in our evolution is that they will co-evolve with us and supplement our own abilities. Now, you're speaking of the mathematician genius. A computer can do these calculations in an instant, and yet they can't see the color red. They can't sense a lot of the analog aspects of our environment. They can't interpret that in the way that we can and interact with our environment. So it's almost like a hand in glove situation where you could develop artificially intelligent robots that would complement human existence, and vice versa. Human existence would allow a better awareness to these sentient robots. Anyway, that's the idea I'm developing in the book I'm currently writing. And then there's the interface, and that's been talked about, interfacing computers with the mind.
Like a direct brain internet
brain
connection.
internet. So you want to know something, or you just zap, you can just think it, and here it comes. They haven't developed an effective interface that doesn't degrade the biology, but our brains are our bodies, in fact, are sacks of water and bones, and they're they're pretty messy. When you look at high-tech instruments and so forth that are very, very precise, we're the opposite of that. But I think that's part of our evolution. Is our technology is going to be closer and more closely aligned with us.
And I think we've covered everything from the Big Bang. Well, not everything, but from the Big Bang, beginning of life, past evolution, the present, the future. I think that's a good place to wrap up. And so if to any listener this conversation was interesting, I will, in the description or show notes, link your book as well as any social links you might have, so that people can dive deeper if desired. And thank you so much for joining me on the show, Richard.
Well, it's been a pleasure. And maybe we'll do it again at a different venue sometime.
Yes, perhaps once I have a studio.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
If you like this episode, I think you'll really like one of these 2 episodes here. Also, please feel free to tell me in the comments if there's anything I could do better with this podcast. It's the best way for me to improve it. Finally, I'd appreciate it if you subscribed and hit the bell icon, because that gives this podcast more credibility and helps me to have more interesting guests on the show.